In 1987 in Goiânia, Brazil, Carlinhos and Lucio are collecting scrap to sell. They enter an abandoned radiotherapy clinic and go to the furthest room, where they find a lead capsule. Carlinhos explains that it's worth a lot of money, but Lucio is skeptical because nobody would abandon something expensive. Using a wheelbarrow, they drag to Carlinhos' house and use tools to break it open, only to find a second capsule. 5 days later, the duo brings the capsule to the local scrapyard and owner Evanildo buys it. That night, scrapyard employees manage to open this capsule and cut the cables on the lid. When Evanildo turns off the lights to close his shop, he discovers that the capsule is glowing and decides to take it home. 10 days later, Evanildo's wife Antonia keeps throwing up and coughing. Evanildo thinks it's their dinner's fault, but Antonia says she's been sick for days. When Evanildo asks about the glowing capsule, Antonia says she has no idea and scolds him for bringing it into the house, calling it evil because she thinks it is what's making them sick. After Evanildo leaves, Antonia reveals she's hidden the capsule under the sink. She asks scrapyard employee Raimundo to carry it and together they get on the bus. Eventually they make it to the health department and wait for hours, refusing to leave without a meeting. Director Janio agrees to hear them out, so Antonia explains that the capsule has made everyone sick, including all the scrapyard employees, Lucio, and Carlinhos. A skeptical Janio thinks it must be food poisoning, but Antonia points out that it happened to families in different houses. Suddenly Antonia feels dizzy and goes outside for fresh air, only to throw up. Janio tells her to go to the clinic, so Antonia says she'll only go if he agrees to get rid of the capsule. Once Janio takes the deal, Raimundo drops the bag and takes Antonia to the clinic. The next morning becomes the first day of the radioactive emergency, which unfortunately coincides with a strike at the general hospital. At the clinic, Dr. Ricardo is checking on all the new patients, Antonia, Lucio, Carlinhos, and the scrapyard workers. They all suffer from dizziness, vomiting, hair loss, and blisters. Meanwhile, nuclear physicist Marcio receives big news from his girlfriend Bianca. She's pregnant, which makes them both very happy. Then they have breakfast with Marcio's father since they came from the city to visit him for his birthday. Bianca thinks they should tell him about the pregnancy, but Marcio refuses. At that moment Marcio gets a call from Ricardo, who shares the patient's symptoms and believes it could be radioactive poisoning. Marcio doubts it because it'd require heavy exposure, so Ricardo tells him about the capsule. Marcio agrees to check it out. Janio picks Marcio up and Marcio uses a scintillometer, which is a device that can detect radiation. As soon as they get closer to the health department, the device goes crazy, and Marcio thinks it must be broken. They decide to go back to a lab to get another one. Meanwhile, Janio's secretary is too scared of the capsule and calls the fire department to get rid of it. When the guys return, they find the road blocked by the fire truck. The scintillometer immediately goes off, so Janio and Marcio run to the firefighter and make him drop the bag. Marcio scolds Janio for being irresponsible and convinces him to organize an evacuation, mentioning Chernobyl as a comparison. Janio activates the fire alarm to make everyone leave the building and the capsule is put back inside. Now Marcio is worried that other places may be contaminated as well, so they check the file to get the scrapyard's address. When they head there, the scintillometer goes off again. They try to talk to Evanildo, but he thinks they're cops and tries to kick them out. When the duo explains that they're in danger, one of the employees who also has blisters tells them where Carlinhos and Lucio found the capsule. Janio and Marcio go to the abandoned clinic but the device doesn't detect any radiation here. Marcio immediately recognizes the bars that originally held the capsule and can't believe such dangerous equipment was left behind. Next they visit Emerson, the Secretary of Health. He's furious because the press has already been investigating the incident at the health department and refuses to evacuate the town. He claims he doesn't have the power to do it, yet he won't call the governor. When Marcio continues to explain how dangerous it is, they call the National Nuclear Energy Commission. Benny checks his files and confirms that the clinic shut down 3 years ago. A cobalt machine was taken out, but there was a second unit that never came. That unit contains cesium-137, a highly radioactive substance. Meanwhile, Marcio finally gets to talk to Governor Roberto and explains that cesium-137 is a fine powder that will jump from person to person. Roberto immediately agrees to evacuate all the exposed people to the local stadium. Afterward, tents and security measures are set up at the stadium. That night, relatives and scrapyard employees complain to Evanildo because more people are getting sick, but he thinks it's just an allergic reaction that will go away now that the capsule is gone. At that moment, Emerson and Marcio arrive with the police. They explain what happened and Marcio even uses the scintillometer to prove that the house is contaminated too, yet Evanildo refuses to cooperate. Suddenly the scintillometer goes crazy because it's detecting high radiation levels from Evanildo's niece Celeste, who is starting to show symptoms. This convinces the family to finally go to the stadium. At Marcio's home, his father is disappointed because his son hasn't shown up to his party. The party mood drops when they hear about a radioactive incident in their little town. Evanildo's evacuation was filmed, so the family is shocked to see Marcio too. Soon Benny arrives at the stadium and compliments Marcio for acting fast. Now Benny wants to test all the isolated victims to determine who is infected, and he's shocked to hear that some people are already in the clinic, since those should be isolated too. Benny then heads to the health department and uses a more advanced device to do a new reading, which confirms maximum radiation levels. Approaching the capsule is incredibly dangerous, so they need to build a containment structure with concrete. Benny uses his device on Marcio too and confirms he isn't contaminated but his shoes are, so he takes them off and throws them into the health department. When Marcio arrives at his house, he decides to leave his clothes outside to avoid putting his family in danger. Bianca and his father immediately bombard him with questions and Bianca accidentally reveals her pregnancy, so Marcio's father wants to hug him in happiness. However, Marcio steps away from them and asks them to keep a distance until he showers. At the health department, a container is being moved into the building to cover the capsule with cement. Benny gets a call from Caesar, the director of his institution. He asks him to send a team and admits he's worried that the water also may be contaminated. Afterward, Roberto tries to scold the team for working behind his back, but Paula and Benny silence him when they tell him the powder may be in the pipes in the air. Their chat is interrupted by rain, which will make the contamination worse. The next morning, Paula checks all the rivers and is relieved to confirm they're fine. However, the rain may cause trouble with the household wells. Reporters contact all kinds of experts who aren't on the team just to keep the news rolling, and they put more fear in the population by saying the water is contaminated. Roberto panics and tells Benny to appear on a press conference to clarify that the water is fine, refusing to wait for the test results. At home, Marcio gets ready to return to the stadium. Bianca complains and reminds him they have tickets to fly home in the afternoon, so he promises to be back before then. At the stadium, the crowd is even bigger. Benny tells Marcio that he must train the cops and soldiers on how to collect samples and use the scintillometers. Marcio tries to tell him he has to leave, but Benny doesn't let him talk. Soon he's on a boat on the river telling the team how to collect samples, while helicopters scan the area from above with the scintillometers. At the hospital, the doctors try to decide who to send to Rio de Janeiro. 6 patients are clearly worse than the others, but João is fine. This means Celeste would be left without a parent. They make the patients drink lots of water and exercise so they can expel all the impurities from their bodies. They also tell Carlinius that he'll be transferred to Rio, and he worries about informing his mother because she doesn't have a phone. He can't write to her either because he doesn't know how to read. The doctors volunteer to write the letter for him. When they inform Evanildo that he'll be transferred too, the other patients want to know why only certain people are chosen. They explain they're only transferring those who need better treatment, and João gets angry when he learns that he can't go with his daughter. Everyone complains and Evanildo refuses to go. In private, Antonia tells the doctors to give her spot to João. At the stadium, Catarina is informed she's free to go. However, her home has been sealed and her family is in the hospital, so she doesn't have anywhere to go. A doctor overhears this, so she lends Catarina clean clothes and some money. Outside, Benny examines Bianca and assures her she's fine. She wants to see Marcio, but he isn't around. At the hospital, Catarina tries to visit her family, but the guards won't let her pass. She waits outside until she sees her family being taken to the bus for Rio, so the doctors let her say a final goodbye. They share a hug and words of love before the bus leaves. Celeste rushes to the window to keep waving at her mother. Afterward, Catarina tries to go home to grab some stuff, but the guards won't let her pass here either. After watching how they aggressively catch all the dogs in the area, she goes to a friend's house to ask for a place to stay, but her friend turns her down because she's afraid. After confirming that the river is clean, Paula and Marcio start heading back. Suddenly the scintillometer reacts and they realize it's coming from a truck, so they start following it and yell at the driver until he pulls over. They scan the paper in the back and the device goes crazy. The driver explains it comes from a warehouse, so Marcio leaves with him while Paula takes the samples to the lab. At the warehouse, Marcio confirms everything is contaminated because the warehouse bought scraps from Carlinius and Lucio. They have to get rid of all the paper and quarantine the building. The owner complains because he has to work and feed his family, so Marcio points out that being here may kill his kids. At the police station, Chief Marlene is handed a file with the capsule case and asked to find whose fault it was. She starts by questioning Clovis, the owner of the land where the abandoned clinic is located. Clovis explains that he owns the land but not the building or anything inside, so it wasn't his responsibility to clean it or set up guards. His company bought the land from Santa Casa Hospital, but when they got there it was occupied by the clinic, which belongs to the Goiás Institute of Radiotherapy. Santa Casa sold the land before the clinic was permanently shut down and they refused to move out until they were forced by legal proceedings. However, when Clovis started demolition, the clinic stopped them by filing an injunction. He did see the capsule in the room, but he thought it was trash because he could have never imagined that the clinic would abandon radioactive waste. Next, Marlene questions the manager of Santa Casa Hospital, who explained she had a non-profit deal with the radiotherapy clinic. They had to provide free care for the hospital's cancer patients, but over time the clinic breached the contract by charging, so the manager sold the land. Marlene scolds her for doing so without evicting the clinic. In Rio de Janeiro, the patients are given private rooms and Celeste is separated from João. Meanwhile, the lab analyzes the patient's urine and discovers that the radiation is so high that it isn't detected when the scanner is close. They call the doctors and inform them that the rest of the patients should be transferred to because their internal contamination is too high. When Antonia starts having a seizure, the doctors immediately sedate her, but at this rate she won't survive. Tired of the situation, a doctor rushes outside to tell a reporter what's happening. He also begs the striking crowd for their cooperation. Finally, understanding how serious the situation is, a few members of the hospital staff agree to help. At the stadium, Paula reports that the wells may be contaminated. Marcio has even worse news. Some of the contaminated paper is already on a truck on its way to San Pablo. Benny calls an institute in that city and orders them to evacuate the paper factory and surround the truck as soon as it arrives. Then Marcio finally goes home, but Bianca has already left. That night, the doctor's statement appears on TV. Doctors in Rio de Janeiro rush to the Naval Hospital and tell the Admiral that they volunteer to care for the additional patients. Meanwhile, Catarina tries to get a bus ticket for Rio de Janeiro, but she doesn't have enough money. At the hospital, Raimundo is tired of exercising and has to be convinced to take his medicine. When a doctor checks on him later, she finds the bed empty and the window open. Raimundo is now at his usual bar trying to get a drink, but nobody wants him here and the clerk refuses to sell, so Raimundo tries to steal something. The other clients threaten him with a broken bottle and a gun, yet Raimundo isn't afraid to confront them. When he's about to get shot, the doctors and the police arrive to take him back to the hospital. When it's time for the press conference, Robert tells Benny to announce that the water is clean. Benny tells reporters that the rivers are fine, but everyone wants to know more about tap water. A desperate Benny decides to fill a bottle with water from the fountain and drink it in front of everyone right as Paula arrives with the test results, confirming that tap water is also fine. However, a reporter knows about the truck going to San Pablo and accuses Benny of hiding information. Although Benny explains that the factory was shut down, the police are sent to block the roads. On day 6, the team is concentrating on cleaning the affected places. At Evanildu's house, Marcio finds a dog and approaches it gently, but the dog jumps on him and bites his arm before running away. Marcio is now at risk of being sick, so he's sent to the hospital too. Meanwhile, Evanildu falls into a coma and the doctors can't wake him up. Then Antonia, Evanildu, and a few other serious patients are sent to the Naval Hospital. A specialist doctor from Russia also arrives with his team, ready to help. However, they're very angry to notice that the hospital isn't following all the necessary protocols. The staff isn't completely safe, Joao shouldn't be there, and the medicine dosages are too high. Their argument is interrupted by a phone call from a scientist who tells them about an experimental treatment used for leukemia patients, which strengthens the immune system and could benefit those affected by radiation. The Russians turn it down, claiming that the man behind the treatment is a quack. Soon the doctors get a call from the hospital dean, who scolds them for not listening to the experts he sent. However, the doctors point out that the Russians have experience with Chernobyl, which was a different type of contamination. Their medicine dosage has been working so far and the tests confirm it, so the dean lets them continue working like that. When Caesar finally arrives in Goiânia, he and Benny have a meeting with Roberto, who is furious because nobody wants to buy the soy and rice produced in their town anymore. He refuses to keep the barrels with all the radioactive material in his town, so Caesar and Benny point out that moving them is too risky. Roberto doesn't care and gives them orders. Benny must find the best empty areas where they can drop the barrels, and Caesar must use his influence as head of the institution to get the deal with the corresponding state. If they don't cooperate, Roberto will blame them for everything. Then Benny visits Marcio, who has been exercising a lot too. Marcio admits he doesn't know if he should tell Bianca about this, so Benny advises him to be honest. Later, Benny calls Bianca and learns she has anemia because of the stress, so he decides not to tell her anything. On day 15, Marlene questions one of the owners of the abandoned clinic. He removed the fencing, roof tiles, doors, and window frames, but somehow he forgot the capsule. The man explains he removed the doors but they didn't let him take anything, and he never knew the capsule was there because they were in a hurry. Meanwhile, all the evacuated refugees are staying at a shelter. A doctor comes to see Katerina and takes her to the general hospital so she can visit her son. They aren't allowed to touch each other, but at least they can share a few words of love. At the Naval Hospital, Evanildu finally wakes up. Unfortunately, Antonia is getting worse and the doctors want to use the experimental treatment, but the Russians keep saying no. The doctors go to see the dean but he refuses to act behind the Russians' backs, so one of the doctors quits. On day 20, Marlene questions the other clinic's owner. The man claims that Santa Casa evicted them and didn't let them take anything. He also says that they never breached the contract. It's a lie Santa Casa made up to sell the land. He swears he did tell the Nuclear Energy Commission about the abandoned parts and that the commission never inspected the clinic while it was open, but he can't prove it. Meanwhile, Marcio calls Bianca every day and since he doesn't get the news, he learns from her that the barrels will be transported to another state. Tired of secrets, he finally tells her that he may be infected, but he doesn't regret it because he's helped lots of people. However, Raimundo doesn't see him as a hero and blames him for everything. For the past few weeks, Katerina has been working as a cleaning lady. On day 22, she learns from the news that her daughter is in critical condition, so she decides to use her savings to buy a ticket to Rio. Unfortunately, access to the city is restricted, so any person who wants to enter must present a certificate proving that they weren't contaminated. The bus has no choice but to take everyone back. At the Naval Hospital, Evanildu sneaks out of his room to try to visit his wife, but the doctors stop him. They're interrupted by Joao, who says Celeste isn't responding. The doctors rush to stabilize her, but there isn't much they can do. Later, Caesar uses his influence to get the doctors a meeting with the medicine board, so the woman who quit comes back to make her case. When the Russians try to protest, the doctors point out this isn't Chernobyl, which convinces the board to approve the treatment. On day 25, the experimental medicine arrives and the doctors immediately give it to their patients. Sometime later, various indigenous communities travel to the capital to protest because the barrels will be sent to their lands. Roberto doesn't care until he gets a call from another governor, who is ready to fight him in front of the president. At the hospital, Celeste and Antonia are undergoing the new treatment, but sadly it's too late for them. They suffer from a heart attack and the doctors try their best to keep them up until they both die. When it's time to bury them, the bodies are put in lead-reinforced coffins, yet many protesters go to complain because they think the burials will contaminate the environment. Katerina cries on Celeste's coffin until she's pulled away. When the coffins are buried, the protesters go crazy and the team has to be escorted out. On day 30, 2 scrapyard workers also die. Evanildu is drowning in guilt and wants to see his brother, convincing the doctor by pointing out that he couldn't see his wife before she died. He keeps a safe distance from Joao and reads a poem before apologizing in tears, accepting his responsibility for this tragedy. Eventually, Marcio is discharged and his father picks him up, but Marcio wants to go back to work. At the same time, Benny and Caesar point out that Roberto won't look bad for keeping the barrels if the order comes from the president, and they have a few contacts in Congress that can make it happen. Roberto agrees to start building a storage facility, but they'll tell the public it's temporary until the orders arrive. Sometime later, Benny is informed he's being indicted by the federal prosecutor for manslaughter. Caesar and his lawyer want him to blame the health department, but Benny admits his institution didn't do the necessary checks either. Since he won't be able to work, he asks Marcio to design the storage facility for the barrels. Thanks to Caesar's contacts, a new law is passed, which makes each state responsible for their own waste. Marcio is the leader guiding the construction of the facility, and the capsule is finally taken out of the health department on day 45. However, when they try to take it to the facility, they find the road blocked by protesters. Emerson tries to negotiate with them, but they refuse to see anyone who isn't the governor. Roberto agrees to meet with them, but the conversation doesn't go well. The protesters only agree to open the road in 2 days so the trucks can pass, but to take the barrels somewhere else. The team gathers to discuss other solutions, but there's no other place in their town that could cover all their needs. Marcio thinks they should break the deal and store it there anyway, but Roberto doesn't want trouble with his citizens. Benny tells him to claim that the team acted behind his back. At the hospital, João is getting worse, so the doctor calls his son. Sadly, João can't speak, so he cries while his son tells him he loves him and that he misses his sister. Meanwhile, Carlinius' arm is in an advanced stage of necrosis, so amputation is his only option to survive. The Russians are against the procedure, and even the admiral protests because it would expose the surgeons, but the doctors tell him they've already found volunteers. During the operation, they almost lose Carlinius, but fortunately the procedure goes well in the end. All the doctors are scanned afterward to check they weren't contaminated. The Russians even agree that the doctors were right after all. When Carlinius wakes up, he receives a letter from his mother and the doctor reads it for him. Later, the doctors confirm that the treatment has healed João as well. That night, Marcio and Paula take the trucks to the storage area, only to discover that the protesters are blocking the road this late too. In the morning, reporters cover the whole incident. When Marcio talks to the crowd by appealing to their sense of responsibility and humanity, it finally changes their minds and the barrels are taken to the storage. In a public interview, Benny acknowledges that the Nuclear Energy Commission and related institutions that are supposed to keep clinics in check share responsibility for the incident. He also calls Antonia the true heroine, since she prevented the situation from getting worse. To prevent future disasters, the Commission signs an agreement to intensify inspections of radiotherapy equipment and to implement stricter control policies. This is enough for his charges to get dropped, but Caesar is angry because now their institute is under the government's microscope. Before Marcio flies home, Benny informs him that he's recommended him for a position in the Nuclear Energy Commission, so they'll see each other again soon. Later, the government starts demolishing the contaminated buildings and Katerina sneaks into the sealed area to watch her house come down. Paula promises that the government will help her and gives her a picture of Celeste that wasn't contaminated. While Marcio reunites with Bianca in Rio, João and Evanildo are finally released. However, they have to visit the hospital regularly for checkups. 2 more boys are released in December, while Raimundo and the final survivor have to wait a little longer until their tests are clean. This was based on a true story, which is considered the worst nuclear incident outside a nuclear plant. 5 employees from the Radiotherapy Institute were convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and the National Nuclear Energy Commission had to pay 1 million reales to guarantee medical care for the victims. The protocols developed by the team became a global reference. There have been no incidents in the storage site, and the Health Surveillance Agency was converted into a state center for victims of radiological accidents. On top of the initial 4 deaths, 16 more were found later related to radiation exposure. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.